Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Bitter, and today I am joined by a guest for this interview, my wife, Nicole Bitter. Nicole just recently completed the Javelina 100 this last weekend, and that race was really exciting for a variety of reasons. One being that it was pretty easily the most competitive field that the Javelina 100 has put together on the women's side to date. And on top of that, in my opinion, it was probably the second most competitive female 100-mile field in the United States behind the Western States Endurance Run, which is pretty much every year the most competitive 100-miler on both the men's and women's side from one year to the next in the United States. And oftentimes it's not even close, which I think the women's field this year got about as close to Western States level competition as we've seen for the most part. So there was a lot of anticipation with this one leading into it, a lot of potential outcomes, and such a wide variety. And Nicole and I touched on this a little bit in the beginning, so I won't get into too much detail here. Just the types of runners that kind of came in their resumes and how their strengths and backgrounds kind of differed, but all culminated in what was ultimately a very exciting day. And it lived up to expectations, no doubt. Within that topic, what we're going to talk about a little bit is just Nicole's kind of preparation, kind of what makes maybe her buildups unique given her career occupation that goes alongside her training and racing, which can oftentimes make preparing for these sort of things a little bit unique. Also, just a little bit of a outline of kind of how the day went for her and like how the day played out. And then ultimately a topic that is both relative to this year's Javelina 100, but also a bigger topic that I think is in need of having more discussion in sports in general, but also within the ultramarathon and running community too, which is how are we going to categorize events going forward? So what made this year's Javelina 100 a bit more unique than prior years is they released a third category for the race. So the typical male-female category was added to with a non-binary category, which personally I think is probably the future of most, if not all, endurance races, is adding more categories to be more inclusive. What makes Javelina a bit more unique than other races that have done this so far within the ultra running community is there's a lot of stakes at the Javelina 100. At the moment, there's only golden tickets available for the men's and women's field. So how do we address that situation in terms of distributing golden ticket races? Is it something where we add a third category of potential automatic entrances through that category? Or do we continue forward with what ultimately they do at the moment, which is having any athlete who identifies as non-binary also select which category between male and female they want to participate in from a results standpoint when it comes to things like prize money or race entry type things in the future. And there was just some implications at this year's event that we talk about that kind of made that a little bit more front and center than it maybe would have otherwise. And just our thoughts about that topic in general outside of this race. When you add in other variables like biologically born male, female versus, how we kind of navigate that type of a topic in the sport, and hopefully open up communication and respectful dialogue about it going forward so that we can be as inclusive as possible within a sport that has an element of competition without necessarily creating disadvantages for other people at the same time. So those are kind of the three big topics that we hit on for this one. Before we get rolling, I just have a couple quick announcements. On the show's Patreon page at the moment is an interview I did with Brody Sharp. Brody is actually a return guest. This was his third time on the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I love talking to Brody about all things kind of injury and rehabilitation based. So for that episode, we focused on three topics that were from his most recent book. And those included detecting and managing early signs of injury, training basics for injury reduction, and third, strength training and cross training, and kind of how those feed into injury prevention or don't, and just how to maybe use those as a tool in your training toolbox. That episode is up on the show Patreon page. Like I mentioned, some perks that you get by joining the show Patreon page is early release ad-free audio. So you can access episodes as soon as they're done being recorded before they're released to all podcast platforms. You also get the episode minus the intro and minus the advertisements. So if you want to get right to it, that's your spot. You can access the show Patreon page by heading to zachbitter.com/HPO. That URL will also host a variety of other things related to the show, including links and details to prior episodes, also non-Patreon related support options for the show, and basically everything related to the podcast can be found through that landing zone. If you want to help support the show non-monetarily, one thing that goes a very long ways is if you like and subscribe to the episodes that you enjoy or the podcast in general on your favorite listening platform, and then sharing it on social media or with friends and family so that if you find an episode that you really find valuable, it gets spread out to other folks who are interested in the topics that are being shared as well. If you want to see different options for the show sponsors, there is a landing page that holds the details, the links, and the discount codes for all of the show sponsors, including today's episode. That is just at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Today's episode sponsors include Element T's electrolyte powder and Athletic Greens multivitamin powder AG1. Athletic Greens' flagship product, AG1, is a supplement that contains 75 high-quality vitamin, minerals, whole food sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens that will help start your day right. I like to take 1 scoop of AG1 first thing in the morning. Usually I'll mix it with about 8 ounces of cold water and have that right before my first cup of coffee. I like to take it on an empty stomach because per Athletic Greens, that's the best way to absorb all of those 75 high quality vitamins and minerals the best. So usually I'm heading out for a run after I've been awake for about an hour or so in the morning, and I like to have an empty stomach anyway, so that fits nicely there along with my cup of coffee first things first. AG1 is lifestyle friendly and fits into a keto, paleo, low carb, dairy free, or gluten free and even vegan diet. It has only 1 gram of sugar, no GMOs, and is free of artificial ingredients. AG1 continually updates their product based on the latest science and third-party testing. On top of that, they donated over 1.2 million meals to kids in 2020. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. I love these travel packs because they're these little green square packages that lay flat, and I can just stuff a few of them in my suitcase. And if I'm out of town for a few days, I know I got that first thing in the morning, 75 high-quality vitamin minerals sitting there waiting for me. So if you want to check that out, all you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/HPO. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/HPO to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. You can find links to that in the show notes as well as at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. This episode sponsor is Element. Element makes an electrolyte supplement with no sugar. Each packet is loaded with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. They come in convenient single-serve packets that make them great for bringing along for a run, hike, going to the gym, or while traveling. My go-tos are the citrus flavor and the newly restocked watermelon flavor for my long runs and post-run rehydration, as well as their chocolate flavor, which I love to add in my morning coffee with a little bit of creamer. Tastes great, and it's a fun way to start the day for me. If you are hesitant or would like to try out Element first, before you purchase, they are offering a flavor sample pack with one of each of their flavors for free to anyone who uses the HPO URL. If you want to check them out and support HPO along the way, you can head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO. That's drinklmnt.com/HPO. Links can be found in the show notes as well as at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. I'm super biased on this, but I can say it's my favorite guest to have on the Human Performance Outliers podcast. Nicole, thanks for taking some time out of your busy work day to chat with me a bit.
Yeah, happy to be here. I don't do a lot of podcasts, so I hear a lot, but not on many.
Yeah, and we sort of have a couple other guests here that you might hear rumbling around in the background. Those are our dogs, Stella and Minnie, and they are always interested in what we're doing. So when we're sitting together, they're never far away, but hopefully they won't be too big of a distraction for today's episode. Today's topic, though, is going to be kind of a dive into the Javelina 100 that happened this past weekend. Nicole was one of the participants in that. So we're going to go over a little bit about just how you prepared for Javelina and maybe some uniqueness about your lifestyle that kind of both creates opportunities and hurdles for you within racing and training and things like that, as well as just how the day played out. And then finally, a third topic that was a little more pronounced at Javelina this year than in the past, which is just gender categorization in sports, and maybe like what our thoughts are on kind of the current structure of that and what are some potential options going forward with this sort of a topic, which I think is at times a little polarizing and people get maybe emotional about it and upset about it at times. So we do want to just out front make sure that everyone listening just kind of knows when we do get into that topic, this isn't something that we are set in stone on in terms of our own personal beliefs, nor do we believe most people should be. So with topics like that, I think communication and a willingness to be able to speak about it without fear is a big step forward, and a step forward I hope our community can make in the future as we kind of continue to explore the different opportunities that we have within our sport to be both inclusive and fair at the same time. Nicole, anything else we should add to that before we get rolling here?
I think we're set.
Awesome. So Javelina is a race that you're familiar with, right? I think I remember in 2020, you preparing and training for that during the kind of the height of the pandemic was an interesting opportunity. What do you remember about preparing for Javelina in 2020?
Yeah, so it was definitely a different world at that point. So we were living in Phoenix, which made preparation a bit easier, right? Because we could certainly train on the course itself. So that course specificity, you can't do better than actually running loops at McDowell to get ready for Javelina. But I think it was a unique time where essentially the world kind of stopped. And so from a running perspective, I found that probably I had a lot more availability to train than I potentially had in the past. So historically, from a job perspective, I did a lot of traveling. And so fitting in training between flying and such and client meetings was a bit more challenging. And during the pandemic, it was the unique opportunity where travel was halted. So I really got in some great training before that event. And I think it played out well in 2020. I know we did a lot of speed together, so that was certainly also fun. Many morning runs to get in that speed, which I think played out phenomenally for Javelina.
Yeah, I think we sort of drew up a good blueprint for you at the individual level, I think, as to like what gets you prepared physically and mentally for a 100-mile race that's sort of like Javelina, more like a runnable 100 trail like that. And for you, it's a lot of what I would call kind of reverse, like a reverse periodized schedule, which you maybe see in a typical endurance event where you're doing things that are least specific to race intensity earlier on the plan. And then we're getting a little more specific as we get going. The thing that I think maybe stands out about you that's a little different than what I maybe see in the norm coaching people is you tend to really respond to the speed work well. You really like it. So in your training, I think what sometimes taxes you probably more mentally than physically is if we get too crazy with long run stimulus. If we're doing like long runs throughout the entire plan, or we're starting those too soon, they pile up. And then by the time you get to the starting line, you're kind of a little bit fried on the activity that you're trying to perfect on the day. So I remember in 2020, we did a ton of speed work. You were sort of a bit of a late entry into Javelina. So we had just enough time to kind of lay down some long run development stuff. But it was enough, and you knocked it out of the park and won that year. So coming back was obviously exciting for that very reason. The field was a little different this year, though. What can you tell us about the field going into Javelina in 2022 versus 2020?
Yeah, well, wow, it was intimidating. So such phenomenal runners lining up at that start line. Certainly awesome performances, but I can't even name how stacked that field was. And so I think knowing that, I knew that I was going to have to run a smart race and not get sucked in and start out too quickly for me, because I knew it wouldn't be sustainable. I think there's also that elephant in the room where I also know I turned 40, and I know there's always historically been the case that, ultra runners improve as they age. And I think to some extent there is validity in that. But I would also say that I think it becomes even more critical to really be smart with training and not overdo things. And sometimes I know I have a lot of other competing priorities in my life that sometimes interfere with having the most effective training. And just so I know in the back of my mind that there's always that element. So, I just wanted to go out there and give it my all. And I figured, at the end of the day, all you can do is your best, right? So I showed up at the line and just wanted to make sure to execute to the best of my abilities. And, knowing that at the end of the day, perhaps there would be people that would be faster than me there, which that is the nature of sport, right? I mean, that's what's so cool about sport, is knowing that there are excellent individuals out there, and you're just trying to do the best you can.
Yeah, it's a tough balance between like trying to determine where your level of compete is amongst the field, as well as also knowing when it's a race as long as 100 miles, if you deviate from your own plan that works too much, which in this case would likely be going out too fast. Yeah, where's that line at, and how close can you get up to it without overreaching and end up running slower than you would have otherwise, and then ultimately falling further back than you would have if you had just run your own race and let some of the quicker miles that others were doing early kind of pass by. But you definitely had some experience with that in 2020. The field wasn't as deep, but Camille Herron was there, and Camille is obviously quite fast and can oftentimes sustain that fast start. So you had a little bit of experience of just kind of letting the front go from that particular race. But yeah, just I think the uniqueness of Javelina this year is it sort of emerged sort of in the course of a single year as being what I would consider probably the second most competitive 100-mile starting list for the women's side of the field in the United States, behind Western States, obviously, as being the one that has historically been not just the most competitive, but by a fairly large margin. I think Javelina this year, when you look at the talent pool that was in it, it was getting as close as any 100-miler really has to a Western States caliber talent field that you could really race in. So, just for some examples, I mean, there was former Western States champions there with Casey Lichtai, and there's former Javelina champions with, again, Casey and Devin Yanko. Lots of other talent in there as well with like Brittany Peterson. I mean, Brittany Peterson hasn't won Western States, but she may as well have. When she was second there, I mean, her time wins it almost every other year there.
The list goes on. There were so many phenomenal women, and I think that's why going in, it's intimidating, right? That list was striking. I remarked to you that I thought the women's race was even more competitive than the men's on that paper. And I think it played out that way. And when you look at even just how many results in the top 10, I think it's pretty striking how phenomenally the female field was, right?
Yeah, and to add to it, it had a little bit of excitement too, because I think whenever you have a race that goes as deep as Javelina this year, you have the people that have proven on a course like that, like you, Devin, Casey, Brittany. Then you have some newcomers that have a lot of potential, but are maybe a little untested on that type of event. And we had that too. There was, Annie Hughes coming down off the mountains, who was won Cocodona this year, recently won Run Rabbit Run, and decided to try a more runnable race, which I think is really cool when you see people in the sport really branching out where they're willing to kind of like test their limits on from a variety of courses. You had Manuela, who is a very high caliber, I think like a mid 230 marathoner. She won, what was it? What was the ultra that she won? Tarawera. She's won Tarawera. So hadn't run 100 miles yet, but very much had the talent to crush a race like Javelina if she had her day. And then Heather Jackson coming over from the triathlon community. She's very well recognized over there, but hadn't done 100 yet, and ended up being the early pace setter for that day.
Yeah, I mean, and the list goes on. Anne Marie Matted,
Yeah.
Katie Drews. I think that again, like it goes back to there were so many talented individuals. Riley, phenomenal event. I mean, just put together a stunning performance. The list, it played out, and the race was really competitive. And I guess at the end of the day, in the sport of ultra running, you want to be in a competitive field. So, yeah.
Yeah, I want to say, like, as someone who's paced and crewed a lot of times, like when we're getting into an event that you're peaking for, there's always a big question in my mind as to like how things will play out, because I've seen you execute like you did at Javelina on a number of occasions. Obviously, previously at Javelina, you've had good days at Western States when I've been able to help you out at Black Canyon, races where you just were rock solid, consistent all day. But there's also been races where I think you're ready physically, but life happens, right? And I mean, you have a very demanding day job, and it's not a guarantee that that's not going to flare up on you at the most unideal time, like leading into a race. I think we saw that at Western States last time you ran it, where you're kind of in the heat of administration changes, and now you're getting clients audited and things at a higher level than you normally would. So you just had this enormous mental stressor on your mind, like literally the day of, or not the day of, but the day before the event itself, leading all the way up to that. And you can't just kind of unlearn that and start racing and expect that mental bandwidth to be there if you've been burning it on other things like the week or weeks leading into it. So I was a little nervous going into Javelina this year, because we've just had a lot of change in the last year. I mean, 10 months ago, we moved to Austin from Phoenix, which is a pretty big transition that comes with moving to a different state. With that, your routine changed a bit. And some of those were very positive, but they also present hurdles, like a lot of positive things sometimes do, where you've had the opportunity to train with the road running group, which gives you opportunity to do workouts with them on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings. And you're also leading their trail group on Saturday mornings, which has been, I think, a really positive element to your running, but also comes with the exchange that those are early mornings. So you have a busy work schedule, and now you're also getting up sometimes before 5 a.m. to do that stuff. You get to the weekend and it's like almost a mandatory, like 2-hour nap on Saturdays and Sundays in order for you to make it through the week and not feel like you're just running on fumes. So I was a little nervous maybe that with all the changes we've had in the last year, that would potentially be a mental stressor or even physical stressor to some degree that would make it hard for you to execute the way you did in 2020, when you had a little bit more flexibility going into the race, with work demands kind of downgrading a bit, with everyone trying to figure out what to do with the pandemic and canceling travel and all of that. Was that on the back of your mind, or are you able to just kind of like block that out and then go see what happens and then ultimately figure out on the race course whether that is the reality or not for you?
No, I mean, that's always in the back of my mind. It's hard. I've just made the decision as a human that I want to be very well-rounded. I love to run, but I love other things too. I'm very passionate about my job. I want to continue to move up in my career and prioritize that. I mean, at the end of the day, that's always a huge priority for me, right? I went to law school and I'm very invested in that, and it's meaningful. I care so much about my team at work and making sure that they have the support that they need and supporting clients. I think also I just feel at this stage in my life that I want to give back more. So it's important to me to be invested in a running group, right? Where, teaching other people to love what I love. So there's always, I know I come in with a very full plate, and that's challenging. I think it's really challenging for you to sometimes deal with, because sometimes it probably piles over onto your plate occasionally. But at the end of the day, that's where I find fulfillment, right? Like I enjoy being challenged and having a lot of being more well-rounded. And it can go both ways. I mean, at the end of the day, from a race perspective, I don't know. I mean, oftentimes it doesn't play out in a way that I love it. I know at Western States in 2021, the area of law that I support, I am an employee benefits attorney, and There was significant legislation that was passed related to mental health benefits. And so we created a whole solution to support clients that were being audited in that area. And during the course of that summer, we had so many clients under DOL audit. And so trying to make sure to manage responding and supporting clients in that space with balancing Western states, obviously it wasn't a good result. I dropped out. My body just felt fatigued. I went in as I trained to the best of my ability and I did the runs, but I'm sure there was an element of stress on my life that I wasn't able to deal with. And so I think there's always that phenomenon that needs to be addressed. I mean, stress from all aspects of life certainly plays into running performance. And so, I guess I assume at the end of the day, I'm going to sign up and do the best I can, but I always know, I mean, to some extent, everyone deals with that, right? There's always the possibility for stress, but I probably do understand that sometimes there are swings and misses. And I'm okay with that at this point. I think it used to be harder for me to not execute when I knew I was prepared. But I guess the older I get, the more I feel like I look at the whole span of results across 10 years and it just, it all kind of, you look at it cumulatively versus one event. Mm-hmm. I think you always do a good job of telling me that.
Yeah, you have to zoom out at times like that when you have a bad race. And especially specifically for you, you've been running for such a long time in general in the sport. When you just look at your resume from 3 top 10 finishes at Western States, golden ticketing on a number of occasions, including winning the Black Canyon 100K. Like we said, winning Javelina in 2020, and at the time was the 3rd fastest time on that course. This year changed that a little bit, but
that's okay.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, and you're always going to have year-to-year variances with that sort of stuff anyway. But just no shortage of results that you can be proud of at the end of the day. And I think even though the sport has grown a lot since you got into it, to the point where when you started, the opportunity for you or the competitors to even consider like quitting or reducing their normal job in order to focus more on training and racing, that's just a much more prevalent opportunity for people nowadays. So like, you have that situation though, and I'm not always convinced that that's the best way to go to in some cases, because if you do have a bad race in that situation, you sort of come back with nothing but that in a large degree. Yeah. Whereas if you have a bad race, you can come back and sort of look at running through more than one angle, and then also invest your time and energy back into your career.
When I get back from tough races, I know the next day I'm going to be on calls and at my computer, just going about it at the normal day. People aren't going to know what I did over the weekend besides a couple of friends maybe. So it's business as usual. And I kind of like that because it means like, I'm not uber focused on it, right? It's just move on, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what it takes. It's like, you can't dwell on bad performances. Otherwise it's going to ruin your life. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of runners have that. I mean, I certainly can relate. I've had moments like that, but I find that the older I get, the more I like that balance to just move on to the next thing and say, okay, conference call 9 a.m. I'm ready to go. Better prepare. So.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's sort of besides the point for this year's race, because in hindsight, we can look back and just reflect on what you ended up doing. And it was about as well executed a race as we could have imagined, given everything we've already talked about. But going into the race, I think like with a course like Javelina, where you're doing 5 loops, desert heat, totally exposed, you don't get an ounce of shade at all. Other than when you come through the start finish line every 20 miles or so, and you can maybe step under a tent for a few minutes and do some topical cooling. You're out there, you're exposed. The first lap's a little cooler, but on a race like that, it's going to get out faster than it should if you're looking at it from like a even split or a slight positive, slight negative split. So you do kind of have to be comfortable letting people go out of sight, even not just like, okay, I'm behind them, but I can see them up there. So you came around that first loop, which is a little bit longer than the other ones. So they add like a little 2.5 mile section in that first loop just to get it to 100. So the other ones that are just over 19 average out. You come through that in what we believed at the time, I think was around 10th place. How are you feeling after that first loop in the semi-cooler weather, having gotten the long one out of the way, kind of knowing approximately maybe where you were in the field?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I anticipated I was. I just had that sense that I was probably around 10th. And wow, I mean, the field just shot out of a cannon. I mean, I I wasn't even close to some of the leaders. And at that point, it's always scary, but at the same time, I know what I'm capable of, and I wasn't capable of going faster and executing a strong race. So I just tried to stay in my zone, and I, just focused on what I needed to do. So yeah, I guess I wasn't super anxious at that point because I had a similar experience in 2020 where I had been quite a bit behind. And again, I knew the reality was there were a couple of ladies in that field that could knock it out of the park, and perhaps were just able to beat me regardless, right, on my best day. And so at that point, I was really just locked into what I could do, and I was focused on what I felt like was reasonable.
Do you find it easier in a race where you look at the field and you're like, okay, I can compete in this field, but there's maybe one or two runners where you kind of in the know in the back of your head, if they knock it out of the park and I knock it out of the park, they probably win. Does that make it easier for you to just kind of run your own racing? Because like trying to match someone in that position is likely going to end badly for you?
Yeah, I'm very comfortable with that. I mean, I don't in any way that for me that's very logical.
hmm Yeah, sorry, there's a little bit of a pivot, but it popped in my head when you were talking about
Yeah.
the first loop. The second loop, you came around, which gets you to around 42 miles or so. You looked great. And you came through in your splits. I actually think your splits were a little too fast, those first two loops. I wouldn't say so fast that I was nervous about it, especially because you came through that second loop and you looked great. You were optimistic. You were right where I think we wanted you to be. You had moved up from what we thought was around 10th from that first loop to around 7th. So progress, right? We're moving up. You moved up a couple spots.
Yeah, I was running with Casey and Riley, I think at that point, and Anne Marie, I think, joined us in the third loop. And yeah, I think it was just trying to stay solid and felt
Still
good.
early.
I didn't feel like I was running on clouds. Some days you just have that feeling where you just feel phenomenal and you're just everything is effortless. I didn't have that feeling. I felt like I was okay, but I just kept hammering like it, at a reasonable rate. I just wanted to keep putting one foot in front of the next and continuing on.
hmm Yeah. And then you come into loop 3, which I like to call the moment of truth at Javelina, because loop 3 is interesting to me because you finish it and you're just over 60 miles in and you've gone through, if you're in the lead pack on either the men's or women's side, essentially, you find yourself in a position where you've done the hottest loop of the day from the temperature standpoint. You've got plenty of fatigue in your legs at that point because you're well past your longest long run. You're well into ultramarathon territory at that point, but you're staring down what I call the double barrel of loops 4 and 5, which can be very daunting if you're not feeling good. Course like that, where it's going to be hot and hard to deal with, even on a cooler year for Javelina, you really have the opportunity to come in a little cooked if you went out too fast. And if you're overheating on the top of it, it's just like the level of motivation to wrap your head around the fact you're going around that loop 2 more times can be devastating. When you came in on loop 3, I was a little worried. You looked like you got in there just in time. What were you thinking at the end of loop 3?
Yeah, I think that's the reality. I think you and Lauren are amazing and got me ready to go, but I was feeling it. But I think I was maybe a little low on calories. And so it was just one of those moments where I think I ate a lot at that point, and then you were with me. So I think once we got started, I felt like the fourth loop ended up going okay.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
It was kind of funny because you came in, you looked definitely more worn than you did after loop 2, which caught me a little bit off surprise because when you came through loop 2, you looked so good. I was like, my mind kind of went to like historically when you're rock solid all day, like you kind of have the same demeanor all day. And I almost wait for there to be a bit of a fall off and it just doesn't arrive. And then we're at the finish line and it's like, wow, nice race. This time you came through, it looked like you had been overheated a little bit. You said you were a bit behind on calories maybe. So we took a couple of minutes before heading out on that fourth loop, which is when I can start pacing you. We got you soaked
a lot of cold ice water, which I'm sure you hated at the moment, but as soon as we were done with it and if your core
Yes.
temp came down a bit, you probably were thankful for that. And it was probably the most food I've seen you eat in an aid station since you won Black Canyon, where you came through, I think, mile 28 station and left with like a full muffin and cookie or something like that. We filled you up, got you some water and electrolytes, a little bit of caffeine, and soaking wet, brought your core temp down a little bit. And it probably took us a couple miles for all that to kind of set in. But once we got about 2 miles into that loop, you started clicking. We were running with Casey at that time still. And once we kind of went through that first aid station, started climbing up to Jackass Junction, which is the midway point of the loop. I was so excited watching your splits going up to Jackass Junction because they were better than they were in 2020 on loop 4. You didn't walk a step on that. Everything was like your slowest miles were still in the 9-minute mile pace range. So you made quick work of that climb. And when we got to the top there, in terms of watching the leaderboard, I thought the next person you'd probably catch based on where you came through on the third loop was Manuela. And I think she had dropped out somewhere between the start finish and Jackass Junction. So we weren't sure. We didn't know that at the time. Mm-hmm. When we got up to Jackass Junction, what I didn't expect to hear was that Brittany Peterson was only like 2 minutes ahead of you. She had just gone over the hill while we entered that aid station. And she was, I think, about almost 20 minutes up on you at the start. So I didn't anticipate we'd catch her, if we did at all, until the end of the fourth loop or somewhere in the fifth loop. So that was a bit of a surprise to me. What were your thoughts there going through that aid station, getting that information, knowing, okay, I have an opportunity to move one step closer to what ultimately in this race is kind of a race for the top 2 to get a golden ticket for the Western States 100?
I mean, I don't know how much thinking I was doing at that point. I was just trying to put one foot in front of the other. I knew I had to keep fighting, right? So I was getting tired for sure. And it's always a good feeling when you feel like you're moving up in the field. It's always hard to pass people too that are struggling and working hard, especially friends that are, but I was just glad to keep powering through. And I just kind of felt like I was going to hang on to you and just get through the force so we could get to the fifth loop, because the faster you run, the sooner you're done. And that's my motto in life that I learned in high school cross country.
It just happens that in slow motion in 100-mile races, it's a little different than the 5K.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we finished the fourth loop. I think that's where we found out that Manuela was no longer in the race, or certainly not in front of you. So at the time, we thought you had moved into third place going into the fifth loop. And we knew it was Devin Yanko and Heather Jackson ahead of you. Heather Jackson got out at such a fast pace, and being a new 100-miler, my thought was there's no way she maintains. The only question was, does she blow up or does she slow down and hang on for dear life? And word at the headquarters was that there was walking being done. And when someone's walking in a 100-mile race in areas where they could technically run or had been running, if you're someone still running, like, you're making up minutes per mile and can close a rather large gap. So I think the word was that we were 16 minutes out of what we thought was going to be second place at the time. We didn't know yet if it was Devin or Heather yet, though, until I had an update on my phone and found out it was indeed Devin leading and Heather was the one that was fading a bit. What was your mentality going into that fifth loop, knowing that you were within striking distance of moving up another spot at least?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was awesome. You were keeping me updated. You were looking at your phone the whole time. I mean, I think the whole time we were moving up in the field and you had your phone out tracking. So we had a sense of where we are, because it's so critical, right, to know where you are in a field. And so I think I was getting excited. I mean, certainly I was tired, but yeah, I mean, I was just kind of trying to hang on, keep the pace, right? Keep the pedal on the metal and just keep moving forward and working through.
Yeah, I remember on multiple occasions when I would offer you encouragement or give you an update, you'd be like, I'm trying as hard as I can. It was like, well, that's all we can ask, really, right? So we moved a little bit slower this time up to up to Jackass Junction in the fourth loop. I think was the case for pretty much every one of the women in the field that year. Probably the case for everyone, but maybe Nick Curry, actually, he's maybe the only one who routinely negative splits that last loop. But it was interesting because we knew you were gaining on what we perceived to be second place at the time. We went through Jackass Junction. I think we thought we were maybe, I can't remember, we were told or I checked and we were like 4 minutes behind. So now we have a 9-minute stretch, mostly downhill, your favorite part of the course. We know at that point that, given just running the math, you're 16 minutes back at start finish, 4 minutes back at Jackass Junction, that you were closing in at a rate quicker than a minute per mile. And that would likely put you in a position, if nothing changed, to pass that somewhere between the start of that final 9-mile section to finish. As fate would have it, I think it was around 5 or 6 miles to the finish line. So around 94, 95 miles in, we saw Heather Jackson moving. She was running, but running about as slow as one could run while still running. And you were moving quite well, all things considered. And that was the pass you had been looking for. What was the thought like when you finally made that?
Well, I was wowed. I mean, she's such a phenomenal athlete, but I just was surprised, and I just kind of was like, I can't believe this is happening. Because I guess we thought I was in second, and that just was such a incredible feeling.
Yeah. And I mean, given where you started from too, like you're just, the level of patience required to say, okay, I moved up a couple spots that loop, a couple spots this loop, and just that keeps happening.
Yeah.
Eventually it gets to a point where you're just like, you almost wear a little thin with that same track of mind. And then when you kind of get in that position where, okay, it just actually happened, now your brain almost switches from chaser to chased a little bit. And for good reason, because the person behind you was Casey. And Casey she hit a bit of a rough patch, I think, going up to Jackass Junction on loop 4, which is where you put your bigger gap on her. But knowing that someone of her caliber was behind you and likely potential, if she had like a really, really strong finish and you faded a bit, still within shooting range, you got to stay focused. You got to stay moving. You can't take a whole lot of time to celebrate anything yet. At that point, there's still 5 or 6 miles of what would need to be running to get to that finish line. So how did that feel from just like a going to the well standpoint?
Yeah, I just wanted to keep moving and get to that finish line. I was just motivated to be done. I just, at that point in a race, I'm just ready to be finished running.
Yeah. So we enter the headquarters, again, assuming you were in second place, go around the loop, finish. And then we kind of got some information of, kind of how the day actually played out outside of the leaderboard and the reporting. You want to tell us about what kind of happened at the finish line?
Yeah, well, we finished, and I mean, that was exciting. So, we crossed the finish line. I think we saw Devin first, and she said, congratulations. And then, I think Julie told us that I at that point, I still thought I got second place. I think then we were told that it was third. Riley had gotten second, and she came up and and Riley was so kind, came over, said, great job. And so it was just, I was surprised. I probably was at that point a bit brain dead regardless. So, after you finish a race, I'm always exhausted. So not exactly the way I expected things to play out. But at the same time,
it's a hard message to get no matter what the circumstances are. It's not like, your brain went to one area and it was told when you finished it should have been in another. And that's hard to digest. So, this is where we transition to that third topic we want to talk about today. And like, before we get into it, I think some background information on kind of like what was different about Javelina this year than maybe in prior years. And a lot of events, to be fair, this is a transition that the sport has been making now for a bit. So we're seeing this happen more. And before we get into it though, this is a type of topic where I think a lot of times people's impulse is, who's the victim, who's the person who did something wrong or made a mistake. And I don't want to frame this conversation like that, because I don't think this was something where it was any one person. or any one group's fault necessarily, but it's more of, I think, an opening of a door for us as a community to maybe reflect on how we implement changes that we find as a whole to be beneficial for the sport without creating situations where there's people who are, finding themselves paying for something that would otherwise be positive.
Yeah, I think everyone had good intentions, right? So I think going into it with that mindset is critical.
Mm-hmm. And to be totally clear too, it's like with this topic of like having a non-binary category and like welcoming in transgendered athletes into the sport, Riley specifically like did everything they were supposed to do from like the registration standpoint, the racing. There was nothing that Riley did that impacted the decision making that you did, or the fact that the reporting was void of Riley being in the female field despite being in the female field. So the way, for people who aren't aware, it kind of works now, if a race does decide to implement a third category, so we'd have a male category, a female category, and then a non-binary category, is if you select male or female, you're on to the next step because you've already been categorized into that field, one of those fields or the other. Now, if you select the non-binary field, you get another drop-down box that asks you, are you going to participate in the male field or the female field? And based on which one you select there is where they are going to channel your results for the day. Partly just because at this point, the non-binary field is quite small. At Javelina, I think there was 3 non-binary athletes there, Riley being one of them. And where the confusion, I think, ended up happening was there was no real clarification before, during the race, that if you select the non-binary field, you're automatically in the results for the female or male field. And then there wasn't really any indication on what that had to do with golden ticket acquisition. So
because at this point, there's no golden ticket for non-binary category.
Right, which I think is like the next level to the question that sort of went unanswered going into this event, despite having this implementation put in place. So in a perfect world, what would have happened, I think, would have been, if you're going to go with that setup where you click non-binary and then select female as your results list, you will reflect on the leaderboard and the I guess the scoring, you call it, for the day as being in that field. So your competitors are aware that where you're at and kind of how you're performing. And I'm sure if we asked Riley, she'd probably prefer that, or that they would prefer that that would be available information and it wouldn't be kind of hidden under the non-binary category, despite having their results being counting towards the female field. And that's really where I think the majority of the confusion was on that particular day. Is that kind of how you understood it too?
Yeah. I mean, I think when we take a step back, you just want to know at the end of the day who you're racing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was some commentary that everyone should know who they're racing based on the entrance list. Apologies, I don't have time to track down 700 entrants and evaluate that. So I think, knowing that there's a clear indication of who is in what race is critical, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when you're at a race as competitive that's serving as a qualifier for Western states. So I think certainly in the future, there's the opportunity, because again, I think we were of the mindset that I was in second place. And so we were running using that data. So yes, I think that at the bottom line, and I think that's, I don't think there's a lot of individuals that would dispute that makes sense. I mean, that seems pretty logical.
It seems reasonable for sure. I think my biggest, I don't know if I'd call it a criticism, but my request perhaps is like, with this sort of thing, I think we're seeing the landscape shift. We have some precedent with some of the bigger like world marathon majors like Boston, New York, Chicago. I believe all 3 of them have a non-binary category going forward. These are huge events, right? Like much bigger than any event we have in ultra running. And they also have some precedent with categorization outside of the male female category. A lot of these races also have like a wheelchair division. They have a visually impaired division and things that allow them to kind of have already sort of to some degree worked through this multi-category approach. Whereas with ultra running, one of the things I see is like when we want progress and we want to advance into some new frameworks and things like that, step one is deciding we want to do it. Step two is making sure that we actually have a process in place so races like Javelina have some structure to lean on, so they don't feel like they're reinventing the wheel on the fly, like I'm sure, Jamil and Arabipa probably felt like was sort of happening this year at Javelina, where the pressure's there for them to flip that switch and add that non-binary category. But I'm not sure what level of support Jamil and Arabipa got from the groups of people that were advocating for that, in terms of this is going to be a structure that will avoid a situation like what happened on Saturday.
Well, yeah. And I think taking a step back too, when you think about who's driving some of the decision making, ultimately it's a qualifier for Western states. So there has to be some connection with Western states and their protocol in order to have a similar protocol, right? So there really does have to be some discussion as to how you're going to handle these types of scenarios. And I think everyone was trying to do the right thing. So that's what makes this so challenging. And I'm all for equality and making the sport more inclusive. I do feel, though, I do have this important sense of protecting women's sport. So there's that element as well. So I really want to be thoughtful that in an effort to protect women's sport, we are taking a step back and being critical in terms of how we're structuring all of this. Because I think there's a good answer as to how to structure it. But I think in this case, you saw how there wasn't that protocol in place and things quickly fell apart.
Yeah, and I think like the mistakes that happened kind of this weekend were, I would say, very, very small compared to what could potentially happen with this sort of a shift. And I mean, part of that is because we're on the same page. If you have an athlete who's non-binary and they're a biological female, I have zero issues with them participating in the female field and taking prizes and prize money and awards like Western States. Where I think it starts to get a little more murky is if you have a biological female that is potentially on hormones that would potentially increase testosterone or something like that, or take that a step further, you have a biological male who transitioned to be female, is likely on some sort of testosterone suppressant, but competing in the female field. And that's where I think the real, where the rubber meets the road with this conversation is, what do we do with those type of situations to still welcome in all the non-binary runners who want to participate in sports? I don't think anyone who's non-binary should ever think I can't be an ultra runner because this community doesn't want us here. That's the last thing that you or I want. And most people probably.
And truly, at the end of the day, as a human being, I think that's so critical, right? Making sure we support other people. I think we can do that, though, and still have a place for women's sport. And that's where I think there's an opportunity. And I think there has to be a lot of discussion as to how that's going to be structured. Because I know taking a perspective just from a legal perspective, I think there's a lot of implications that need to be addressed. And, I know a lot of people are working through that. And I think that's something we need to just keep working through. I just do think it's important to also speak up. And I was very hesitant to speak up on this issue. I generally don't even go on podcasts, but
unless your husband makes you, right?
Yeah, exactly. But
She's kidding. Invite her on your podcast. She'll come on.
No. But I also know that if we don't protect women's sport, that's going to be a sad day, because I have sports to thank for the person I am. I mean, I grew up playing sports, and I loved that privilege. And I think as a young girl, I want to make sure that there's those same opportunities. And I think there's the ability to do that, but I do think we need to set clear policies to protect women in sport.
Yeah, I mean, I think where a lot of times we have problems with this particular topic is what you sort of alluded to. One is people are generally afraid to even bring it up. And that's a problem, like, because that screams like there is information being suppressed. And the only reason to really like fight against having that information come up is by silencing people, which I don't think is the way to go. I think we need to be able to have these conversations and be willing to allow people to ask questions and potentially make some mistakes that they can learn from, and kind of move forward there with kind of respect from both sides. And I get this isn't meant to be like, oh, all these non-binary athletes and activists are coming in and shouting down all the others. It's it happens from both ends. You also see a real bigotry coming from certain individuals where they would just as well like categorize a non-binary athlete as subhuman, and that's obviously terrible and not something that we want the direction to head or the pendulum to swing towards in any capacity. Where I think it gets confusing for people is, since we are very much learning a lot about this in real time, it becomes a difficult conversation about what do we know, and based on what we know, how do we either make changes or not make changes? Because you do have sort of a competing, if you want to call it rights, it's sports. It's not, the same as like non-privileged type opportunities, I guess is the way to maybe frame it. But there is potential winners and losers based on kind of how this decision making gets made. And as we've sort of seen some more interest and money put into research on this category, there is, a bit of a debate at the moment as to whether, like, can you have a biological male, go on testosterone reducing drugs and then normalize the competitive field and allow them to compete in the female category without a biological advantage. And, looking at the information we have available now, it's just like, yes, we can suppress testosterone, and that likely does close the gap, which in running is going to be somewhere between about 10 to 12%, I believe, between a biological male and a biological female on average. But if you look into it further, it becomes a much more complicated question than just lowering of testosterone. When you look at just the biological advantages of someone born biologically male versus born biologically female, we're looking at things like bone length and density.
They're known as secondary sexual characteristics.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it goes as far as, if you're biologically male, you have a dump of testosterone in the womb and then again at 6 months. So it's like you're already going to almost by default get those two advantages right out the gate from a testosterone-based standpoint. And when you look at even reduction in testosterone in terms of like muscle preservation and strength preservation and things like that, it's not as big of a dip as I think we would like to see. I would like to see is maybe a weird way to say it, but like that we would need to see in order to realistically assume that this gap is being closed to the point where now having a biological male at birth competing within a female category is going to be, fair.
Yeah. And I think these are questions for biologists to address. And I think there's a lot of decisions that need to be made broadly, right? I think you stated a lot of the key issues. And this is where I think we need science to help us with some of the decision making. And I think that's critical to have the right people. Again, it's a very, very complex topic that I don't feel comfortable weighing in on a ton, given that I am not a biologist by background. Absolutely, though, very challenging and just a lot of complexities. And I think at the end of the day, there's that importance that we all just are respectful of one another. And it's just unfortunate that you see a lot of disrespect in this space. So I think hopefully, in the future, things improve, because at the end of the day, we're all humans. And I think that's very important.
Yeah. I'm not a biologist either, but I think like when I think about it, based on what I believe we know at the moment. And again, I mean, I'm open to information that I'm not privy to, but as far as I can tell, at this point in time, it doesn't seem like we can suppress the biological advantage of a biological male to the degree that would need it to be to level the playing field. Now, you can make an argument that leveling the playing field is entirely an elite part of the sport, and really that's the only question to be answered here. And then you could also further make the argument that we don't care about that, and therefore we should just let it all kind of happen without any attention paid to it. And if that's your position, like, I'm not going to push back on you holding that position. I'm going to maybe disagree I'm going to just prioritize that more than that person would.
Well, I mean, when you think historically of sport, it's who is going to be the champion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that has historically been the mindset of sport, but coming from an equal playing field. So how do we make the playing field equal? Or are we then creating certain advantages? I mean, that's, I guess, at the end of the day, fundamentally the issue, that it's more of a philosophical
It does
question,
have a
right?
philosophical question involved. That's what makes it complex. It's not just one thing. It's not just the biology. It's also the philosophy and how you couch it too. It's like, some people are going to put a huge emphasis on certain aspects versus others, and that emphasis is going to weigh on how they ended up coming into a decision on like what we should do with this going forward. And I mean, ultimately, we're going to probably see is there's going to be organizations like the Western States 100, which is a precedent setter for the United States, and the ultra running events that kind of are also in the calendar year. And what they decide to do is likely going to be the standard, at least. And then you'll have some race directors do other things and follow suit. And I think but that's likely like the future look at what's to come is what Western States ends up deciding to do with these sort of things.
Yeah, probably.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this episode's sponsors are Athletic Greens and LMNT. You can find links to those in the show notes and at zachbitter.com/HPO sponsors. Take advantage of Athletic Greens' free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 travel packs, and LMNT's sample pack.
I do want to talk a bit about just because this question just keeps going, right? Like there's always a follow-up in terms of, well, if you do this, then what about that? If you do this, then what about that? And one that I find kind of like interesting and worth kind of starting a conversation around is, what do we do if we do end up deciding a 3-category male, female, non-binary? And I think at this point in time, that's what I'd like to see. Mm-hmm. I think that's really our best forward option now, is a 3rd category. But that opens up a question as to what do we do with races like golden ticket races, where historically it's been 2 tickets for the men's field, 2 tickets for the women's field. If we have this 3rd field, how do we include them into the golden ticket conversation? Because it doesn't feel necessarily fair to say, okay, you have your category now just show up and have fun, and then consider yourself included. If at the end of the day they look at, but those other 2 categories get these other opportunities that we don't get, that doesn't feel necessarily fair either. Mm-hmm. But then when you look at it, it sort of becomes a bit of a numbers game too, where you have you have like a lot. I mean, let's look at the Javelina. There was 3 non-binary runners registered in that field versus I don't even know how big. I think the field was like 700. I think 700, which was probably more male than female, I would imagine. But still, we're talking about hundreds on both sides. And to go like a 2-2-2 is probably more than what we would see in the short term with that. So I was trying to think of like, well, what would be an option to include like a non-binary category in a golden ticket, or even some sort of like, I mean, another step to this that would maybe not be fixed by what my potential like solution would be is like, what do you do with races with prize money and things like that, which is maybe a little bit of an easier one, because I think prize money is a little less finite than the golden tickets, because the golden tickets, there's only so many of them, whereas money, obviously every race has a budget and there's only so much they're probably going to bring in, but there's potential to generate more if the sport keeps growing. And then eventually I think the prize money question isn't as big of an issue, because you adding prize money for a non-binary category won't be a big hurdle like it may be at some smaller races are today. But my thought was just like, when we used to have the Ultra Trail World Tour kind of system in place, Western States would offer up, I don't know how many it was, like maybe 10 or something, like entrances into Western States that they would pick based on race resume over like a year or so's time frame. So they would go down, they'd look at like all the potential runners that they could offer a golden ticket to. I guess it probably wasn't called a golden ticket for that. It was just an entrance and a sponsor spot, maybe is a better way to say it. and they would base it off of their body work. So if you ran a really good race a few times a year and they thought, hey, this person could really do well at Western States, probably a top 10 candidate, but doesn't have an entrance because they didn't get a golden ticket, they didn't get into the lottery, we're going to offer them one of ours. Now they can race and we bolster up that field. It's more competitive. I wonder if there's not a way to do something like that where you take a couple entrances to the Western States 100 every year, and then all of the ultra runners that count that enter in the non-binary category enter this selection pool where you have a group of people look at their races and the race results over the last few years. It's like, which one of these individuals are most deserving to get that entrance into the Western States 100? And that maybe fixes kind of the number disparity thing a little bit, and it also corrects for the reality that we're probably going to see a lot of situations like Javelina where across the entire race spectrum, we'll have a much larger number of non-binary athletes versus like the 3 that we saw show up at Javelina this year, or whatever that number ends up being at other races similar to Javelina.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like an interesting solution, but I think it would be important to hear other people's perspective.
For sure. There's definitely holes in it. I just haven't thought about it.
Yeah. I mean, I just personally don't feel equipped to add enough value in this. And those are the kinds of discussions probably that need to be had.
Yeah. And I think that at the end of the day, the final note here, I guess, is to say is like, this is and should and will be an ongoing conversation. And whether you're basing it off of our conversation here or the many other ones that are probably currently ongoing or have been ongoing, it's about kind of continuing this and ironing these things out. So like when I propose a situation like that or a potential solution like that, I fully expect that there's problems with it that need to be addressed. But ultimately, this kind of goes back to what I think I was talking about before, where when we implement these changes, I think we maybe just need to think a little bit more about like whose responsibility, or how as a community do we share the responsibility to come up with a structure within that framework that is going to minimize potential mistakes to the highest degree, so that we don't have like people that get like that end up paying the price, so to speak, along the way. And that's only going to happen with more dialogue around it and less blaming and more teamwork is maybe the way to,
I think so.
to end that particular conversation.
It's a tough conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Well, obviously, like I think we're coming up on time where we have to sign off on this episode. But like we said in the beginning, whether you have questions or suggestions or criticism about Nicole's training and lifestyle or her race performances, or most likely this third category that we talked about with, categorizing genders in sports or in ultra running specifically, feel free to reach out, share yourself. I want to hear things that you think I'm missing or that the greater community is missing. And we can kind of move forward and hopefully find solutions and find a way to be both inclusive and as fair as possible to all participants. Nicole, what else do we have? Anything?
I think that's all.
I do want to give you an opportunity to share where people can find you. I know you said you're not like a huge fan of like excessive social media usage, but you do have some social media channels. You want to share those with us?
Yeah, it's Nicole Bitter. And you oftentimes do a lot of the hard work on my.
Well, I guilt you into doing like really like cheesy parodies and things like that on Instagram Reels, but you've been very willing so far. But yeah, definitely follow Nicole on Instagram, and also give her a nudge to start a monthly podcast herself. I've been trying to talk her into doing a 1 show per month on this podcast platform with, whatever topic she wants. So give her some motivation to pull the trigger on that if you can. Thanks so much, Nicole, for coming on.
Thanks.
Hey folks, thanks for checking out this episode of the podcast. For those of you who are regular listeners, you'll likely know I'm also a professional endurance athlete and coach. If you're looking for a little extra help with your training and programming, I do offer individualized coaching options where you can work directly with me one-on-one. I'll personalize your plan and even scale it up to email collaboration and regular consultations. You can also access either of those on their own if you just want to contact me as you're navigating your fitness journey. I also have some ready-made plans. The ready-made plans follow my coaching philosophy, and they scale from 5 kilometers all the way up to 100 miles and come in 3 different levels. So whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, I've got something for you there. And most recently, I also just added a Strength Athlete's Guide to Endurance program, which will help someone who is primarily a strength athlete who wants to either do an endurance event for the fun of it, bolster up their cardiovascular fitness, or just try something out, try something new. So those programs are built to be able to supplement a strength program so you won't have to give up on your gains in the gym while you're going after some running or endurance related fitness goals. You can find all those things on my website at zachbitter.com. Thanks for checking out this episode. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.